Hello and welcome again to Money Tips. This is Charles Kelly bringing you money tips to help you save, earn, invest, accumulate and ultimately enjoy more money. So I want to talk today about the welfare system, that is the state system that provides pensions, healthcare and all the rest of it. I want to ask you, is the welfare system broke or broken? And if so, what are you going to do to fund your retirement and your old age? Now let me take you back a bit to my story. I grew up in London when, in a part of London called Camden, when it wasn't so trendy. It was quite a poor area, actually. And it was an area where a lot of migrants went to when they arrived in the UK, as my parents did. There were lots of bed sits and houses where you were split into rooms. So there was cheap accommodation around and there was jobs around. And a lot of people come over from places like Ireland, where my family come over on the boat to Holyhead. An arduous journey. And, there was, in Ireland at the time, it was a very poor country. There was little opportunity, widespread poverty. And I went to school with first generation migrants from places like Cyprus in Camden, a lot of Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, India, East Africa, Caribbean, parts of Africa, lots of different countries. And later on I saw a wave of immigration coming in from places like Uganda, where, remember Idi Amin kicking out all the Indian Asians from the countries, and they're taking all the money, so he kicked them all out and the country went downhill. And they were, come over to the UK at that time. And also a lot of immigration from the Philippines in the 70s, 80s and 90s, going into nursing, healthcare and that sort of thing. So, I've seen a lot of this come over, and I grew up in immigrant communities, so I've seen, from my own experience, how those people lived and worked and got on. And I noticed a couple of things. I noticed that they tended to buy their own homes. They bought their own properties rather than relying on council housing, which was quite prevalent in those days. You could fairly easily get a council flat in the 70s anyway. So they tended to buy their own house, perhaps because I remember my mother going and talking to the council. Well, no, we can't give you houses because that's for the English people that have been here, not for you who've just come over here. And my mum sort of accepted that and said, well, okay, I'll accept that. So, perhaps because of that, or perhaps they didn't know the system, they tended to buy their own property. So that's one thing I noticed from my own experience, my own anecdotal observations. And like some of my own family did, they rented out a part of their house, rented out a room, took in a lodger to help make ends meet or pay their mortgage. And sometimes they found that the rent would often cover their mortgage and enable them to save a bit of money and then maybe buy another house. Does that sound familiar? Now, it was inconvenient for them. Of course, they couldn't have their own space and they had to put up with a bit of uncomfortable inconveniences. But, it wasn't that bad, and it did help them to get on a bit, right? So I'll come back to that in a while. So that's how I've noticed things. Now, they also had a tendency to start their own business, again, based on my own observations, perhaps because they couldn't find a job that utilised their own education or skills from their own country. This has always been a big problem for migrants. They've come over here with a degree, and the system here says, no, we don't accept your degree. Your degree that you've studied for 4 years is actually only equivalent to a HNC, Higher National Certificate, or a diploma. So what are you talking about? How do you know? And I think many of the educational establishments and the jobs for the professions have been a bit of a closed shop, and still is in many ways. They don't accept qualifications from certain countries without making them jump through hoops. And but that's another subject. But perhaps because of that, they decided to start their own business. Perhaps people start fun of them. Oh, you opened a corner shop. If you're Indian, you opened a corner shop. But that helped them get on because they could earn more money than people in a job. And so I also noticed that they worked harder than most people. They seemed to be always working. They had 2-3 jobs. Many people I know personally had 3 jobs. They didn't just work in one job. They had a weekend job, an evening job, a part-time job. They were always working and saving money, perhaps rather than spending it. They weren't people who went out to the pub so much. They tended to work, go home, be with the family, and put a bit of money aside, and then buy a property or whatever they did with their money. So that contrasted at the time. And I'm not saying everybody, but at the time, that that contrasted with the mentality of the people that I grew up with in London, that had this mentality of that the government would look after us, and that was based on what was called the welfare state, the cradle to grave welfare state that was brought in after the war. They were told by the government, or we were told by the government, that they would be looked after from the time they were born, the cradle, until they were buried, the grave, cradle to grave. Everything was going to be free, healthcare, education, university with grants, elderly care. If you can't look after yourself in elderly, we'll put you in a council-run nursing home. And people would pay taxes and national insurance contributions, which was supposed to provide for their pension in old age, right? So they also had the safety net, the unemployment benefit system and the sickness benefit system, which meant that they were paid if they're unemployed or couldn't work. Now, this is still here today, but it was that mentality that, the council will do something about it, the government will do something about it. And, I lived in a council flat when I was young, and people felt, that everything had to be repaired by the council. It's not my job, it's the council. Or, the council will sort that rubbish out that's lying there. And that was the general mentality, that the government, the council, somebody else would look after me, somebody else would take care of it, someone else was responsible for that problem. They didn't take so much personal responsibility. And even during when I started working, during my early years in financial services, people would often come up to me and say things like, well, I'd say to them, look, you're not saving enough for your retirement. When you retire, you're not going to have enough to live on. They said, well, what are we worried about it? The government will look after me if I don't have enough pension savings. Or they'd say, the state will look after my wife and children if I die without insurance. And people said this to me, the state will look after them. In many ways they were correct. The state does look after you, and it does provide people without pensions some sort of benefit in retirement. And, that is true. But, at what cost? You're not going to live the life that you want to. Now, the Mature Times, a newspaper called the Mature Times, recently quoted a report. I've got the article here by the Mature Times. They recently quoted a report by Canada Life, which said that almost 2 in 5 pensioners, or 38% of claimants, actually receive less than £150 a week, and that worked out to about 365,000 people. And can you live on £150 a week? Now, you can probably survive on it, but can you really live comfortably on what the state pension provides, or what benefits you'd get from the state pension? Because that's the reality of it. And this is why we hear of pensioners freezing to death in the winter. And this is true. I know someone in the funeral business who said his best time is after a cold winter. So it is a fact. Freezing to death in the winter, or having to make the choice between food or heat. Right? This is a fact. Now, most people, again, will blame the government. You hear people on TV, but the government shouldn't, this is a scandal and all this sort of stuff. Yeah, okay, the government has a part to play. But the fact is, we all have the opportunity to work and save during our lifetime, right? We have a span of maybe 40 years of working, and at which time, we should have saved some money so that you can live for another 20 or 30 years. Is that making sense? It makes sense to me, because most people think they'll be retiring at 60, 65, and it's quite feasible that you can live into your 80s. So you need some money there, don't you? Yeah, there'll be a state pension, but that's a very minimal amount that you need. You still need more on top of whatever the state pension will provide. Now, furthermore, the amount that most people pay in their taxes, hardly covers what the government needs to spend and keep everybody safe, healthy, the NHS, right? Educated, schools. These are huge budgets, and keep the public, the electorate happy during their lifetime, let alone have enough to provide them with incomes for another 20 or possibly 30 years in retirement. So in other words, the taxes that most people pay, especially if you're on a low income, it doesn't cover it all. If you gave all the tax back that you'd paid, it probably wouldn't be enough to live on for a good few years in retirement, and people don't seem to get that. Low-paid people now don't pay any tax. They pay very little tax on a minimum wage income. You don't pay much. You still pay national insurance, but you don't pay much tax. And if you've got a couple of kids at school, well, all that tax is spent, isn't it? That's gone, that money. Well, it's no good saying, well, I've worked all my life and now I haven't got a pension, so the government has to give me that money. No, it doesn't really work like that. Yeah, there's a safety net there, and there's a minimal pension provided, but don't get this idea that your taxes are really, provided everything and you've overpaid somehow into the system and didn't get it back, because in actual fact it doesn't really work that. Governments have to borrow to keep everything going, don't they? They have to borrow every year just to pay everything, and that's basically because the taxes they've got coming in is not paying enough to cover all the interest on the debts and all the rest of it and all the government expenditure. So that's my opinion. The welfare state system and that system at the moment is broken and unsustainable. And this is why really successive governments have had to change the rules, move the goalposts. Retirement ages have increased. People have had to sell their homes to pay for elderly care in nursing homes. A nursing home is 25,000, 30,000 a year. People now can't just expect to get old and say, well, I want free nursing care. No, they'll take your home to pay for it. And this is just a fact of life. Now university is no longer free, apart from Scotland, is no longer free in England and Wales. So, people have to pay for it through a loan system or up front. And as I said, most governments have to borrow, and this is not, unique to the UK. Governments have got the same sort of problems. And if the country's not paying its way as it done in the past, then they have to top it up with borrowings. So, and when we all talk about the government should spend and the government should do this, what we're really talking about is our money, is the money that we're paying in taxes and the businesses pay in taxes. So that's it. The government hasn't got this magic fund and there's no oil wells in the ground to sustain everybody. That's it. We have to produce and, we pay taxes and that those taxes are used to provide, the streets and all the things that go into the things we haven't really built but have to be maintained, and the roads and the police and the army and the nurses and the teachers and all the rest of it has to be paid for, doesn't it? So, and if you look back at when the welfare system was devised, and I've covered this in previous podcasts on the pensions time bomb, as I call it. You look at that time, and it's estimated that people would, live for less than 5 years in retirement. It wasn't that long ago when men were the lifespan of a man, in the last century. It wasn't that long ago when it was only 45 or 50 years old. Now, they also calculated the number of people working would be able to support the number of people in retirement, because there's no state fund. What the pension system and the welfare system is funded out of current taxes. It's not saved up for your retirement. So, there has to be enough people working and paying taxes to pay for people in retirement. Now, so these assumptions that were devised when the system was made are way out of date now. The people now are living far longer, and on average, and more people in retirement than ever before. So the worrying thing is about the ratio of people, which I'll go into in more detail. As in most developed countries, especially in Europe, advances in medicine and diets and exercise have contributed to citizens living longer, and the trend is set to continue. I've got some figures here. By 2050, the proportion of UK population aged 65 and over is projected to reach at least a quarter, or just under a quarter, 24%, up from 17% in 2012. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, but it's a lot of people, and that's according to figures by the ONS, Office for National Statistics. And the fastest increases actually will be among the people in what they call the oldest age. The proportion of people aged 85 and over are forecast to treble from 2% to 6%. Now, this is an actuarial thing. If you live, the longer you live, the longer you're expected to live, if you know what I mean. This is, academics now saying this evolving demographic changes will affect everyone in society regardless of age, because it all has to be paid for. And the even bigger problem is that the proportion reaching retirement age, as it grows, the proportion of people reaching retirement age, the number of working people will shrink due to birth rate decline. Now this is true here, and it's also true in places like Germany. This is a concern because the UK state pension payments are funded through taxation and national insurance from those of working age. Now I've got some figures here. Tax revenue from those in work could fall to keep up with demand for social security, healthcare. I mean, the demands for healthcare are growing and growing as new medicines come in, new techniques come in. People want these things. So that's going to grow. It will never end. And there's someone here called David Sinclair from the International Longevity Centre UK. Yes, there's an International Longevity Centre UK. And he said that the number of people of working age to every pensioner, or the old age support ratio, is forecast to fall from 2.9 to 2.9 by 2050, from 3.3 in the mid-70s to 2006. So in other words, one person in retirement for less than 3 people working, and maybe 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago it was more like 4 for every 1 working. It's projected just in the next 30 odd years to fall below 3 people working to support every person in retirement. So in other words, tax revenue from that group may continue to fall and keep up with demand for all of these things that we have to pay for. This will force governments, says Mr. Sinclair, to make some tough choices. To a certain extent, the government have tried to make some tough choices, but it doesn't win them votes and make them very popular, like with universal credit. Given this problem, that the government has already pushed back the qualification age for state pension to 67. I'm affected by this. Currently, the state pension was 65, and it used to be 60 for women. It's been equalised now. It's taken steps to avoid big shortfalls in pension savings through automatic enrolments. If you're in a job now, you'll probably be automatically enrolled into a workplace pension. And this was introduced 3 years ago. 2% of workers' qualification earnings is saved into a pension, comprised of a contribution also from the employer, and it will eventually rise up to about 8% by 2000. As you go along. But I don't think this is really going to be enough. And the type of pension they're investing in is a pension that is relying largely on the stock market to grow. So workers have been gradually encouraged or nudged into savings, but left unprepared for the complex choices about how to fund for their pension pots and what to do in retirement. So 5 million people have now been enrolled into this pension scheme, but there is a concern over the reforms, whether it's enough, and blah, blah, blah. Now, you can also take your own pension scheme. You can join a company pension scheme and contribute that yourself. But, most people when they're young haven't always got the amount of money they need to fund into a pension scheme. And I've talked about this in my earlier podcast. So those are some of the facts. Now, look, you can find out for yourself what your state pension is likely to be. You go online to the Department of Work and Pensions, or the DWP, for a forecast. And as I said, you can top up your own pension yourself. So is the welfare system broken, as I said in the headline? Well, maybe it's not completely broken yet, but it's certainly creaking at the edges. It needs a real major refit or an overhaul. But unfortunately, it's only been tinkered with and patched up by successive governments because they don't want to tell it like it is. It's not very popular. As with universal credit, even recently they've removed the TV licenses for the over 75s. Now, the TV license I think is about £8 a month, but it's been an uproar. I mean, there's a campaign now to stop that decision. So, I expect that what will happen in reality is that we'll muddle along for a while, and for the next few years and for the next few decades, and they'll patch it up here, make a few changes there, but they won't really take any proper action to deal with the pensions time bomb or the elderly care problem. I haven't even touched on elderly care and social care, which is another Pandora's box altogether. So in the meantime, what I can only suggest to you is that you better start rowing your own boat, not relying on the state or an employer to look after you. You're on your own now. You've got to do something for yourself. Now, there's another theory that maybe the centuries-old party is over for the West as the East grows stronger now and takes more of the economy, more of our lunch away. This is another theory. I don't know. I mean, the 16-year-old Swedish climate campaigner Greta Thunberg said, "Why should the rest of the world suffer so we can live in luxury?" Okay, that was related to a climate thing, but it also relates to an economic thing. Many of the rest of the world, in the developing world, the third world, are living in poverty that we couldn't even imagine, and that has to change. So there's going to be a lot of changes in the next few years, and what can you do about it? Well, getting back to my earlier story, when I talked about migrants coming here and buying houses and renting out rooms, you might say, well, that was all right then, you can't do that now. It's not so easy now. Well, I think you'd be wrong about that. The same opportunities to invest in property are available to you today. And in fact, it's much easier to get in property than it was a few years ago. For instance, mortgages are easier to obtain. Interest rates are lower. There are buy-to-let mortgages available, which were not available then. You had to go to a bank and get a commercial loan at a very expensive rate. You can rent out a room tax-free. I think it's $7,500 a year. It might have gone up. And there are training courses available to help you learn how to build a property portfolio and maybe secure an income for your retirement, even without putting any money down. Now, of those, I think the last point is the most important. When my uncles migrated here, there was no training courses on property. Nobody told you how to get a mortgage or how to buy a property, where to start, how to do the legal side, how to do anything. They had to learn by trial and error, and I had to do the same thing when I got into property. So I wish I'd had courses available to me, because it could have accelerated my progress much faster and avoided, helping me to avoid a lot of mistakes that I made in the early days. And since I've started to attend courses, it's really opened up, in some ways blew my mind and opened up my eyes to a world of opportunity. So these courses are available. If you'd like some information on a beginner's property taster course that you could go on to perhaps get you into property, then click on the link below if there is one, or if not, email me at charles@charleskelly.net. Now, there are other things you can do to boost your retirement, and I've gone through those in earlier podcasts. So have a listen to those. It's about starting part-time businesses, it's about getting into property, it's about just saving. So listen to that. And I also cover these things in my book, Yes, Money Can Buy You Happiness. I talk about this in the book, and I give you lots of suggestions as to how you can, boost your income, not just for retirement, but for now. You've got to live for now as well. So have a look at that. And as I said, think about those taster courses. There's some coming up in the next few weeks. So get back to me. And thank you for listening. This has been Charles Kelly, bringing you money tips to help you save, earn, invest and accumulate and enjoy more money.